Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to the order of February 29, 1960, the hour of 12 noon having arrived, the Senate having been in continuous session since yesterday, the Senate will now suspend for a prayer by the Senate chaplain.
Let us pray. Sovereign God, ultimate judge of the leadership of this nation, thank you for loving us and calling us to be your people. Make us worthy of the honors you have bestowed upon us. Today, give to our lawmakers your grace and peace so that they may use their talents to empower people to live lives of purpose. Lord, invade the thinking of our senators with insights and inspiration that they could not produce on their own. May your omniscient wisdom guide them as you strengthen them to do your will. We pray in your sacred name. Amen.
All post-cloture time has expired. The questions on the Higginbottom nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt. I can't until he...
All right. Start at the back.
There you go. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Yeah. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Pryor.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, you did, sir. Yeah. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island.
She's good. Well,
Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch.
don't always do that.
Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer.
Lab did his talking?
Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions.
Oh, y'all need to decide who leads it. I'll be glad.
Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow.
But you know, what,
Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Booker, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Gillibrand, Isaacson, Johans, Kane, Markey, Murray, and Tester. Senators voting in the negative: Blunt, Rubio, and Vitter. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich. Aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. No. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. No. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller. Aye. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan. Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, no. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. No. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no.
Would you like a normal size pen size?
No, I'm okay. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye.
Well, looks like flood a little air out of the balloon.
Mr. Warner.
Come back.
He's
Line is up a little bit.
He coming in on Sunday?
I'm starting to get a little grumpy.
Over?
Mr. Carper.
Well, I hope.
Mr. Udall.
I hope what Harry does.
Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. No, he hasn't. Mr. Lee, no.
But anyway, we get to keep it probably. It would be nice if we could get both of those things going.
Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Grassley.
There'd be anything wrong with it.
Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye.
Well, I think a lot of third countries.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. You're no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, no. Ms. Warren, aye.
Have a good weekend. Yeah, thanks. Ladies?
Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Rockefeller? Aye. Mr. Flake? Mr. Flake? Aye. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Chambliss? Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Hoven? Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Bennett? Mr. Bennett? Aye. Ms. Ayotte? Aye. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley? Aye. Mr. Cruz? No. Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown? Aye. Mr. Manchin? Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Pryor? Mr. Pryor? Aye. Ms. Hirono? Ms. Hirono? Aye. Looking for 10. There's a couple of them. So White House. Shaheen is in the room. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 74, the nays are 17, and the nomination is confirmed. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Ann W. Patterson of Virginia, a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, class of career ambassador, to be an assistant.
The clerk will continue to report.
To be an assistant secretary of state, signed by 18 senators.
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
I ask consent that the mandatory quorum be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection, under the previous order, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate... The Senate will come to order. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Ann W. Patterson of Virginia, a career member of the Senior Foreign Service class of career ambassador, to be an Assistant Secretary of State, Near Eastern Affairs, shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso.
Thank you. You have Ms. Nye, right?
You got me? I got you. No, I don't have you.
That's it.
Cloture.
Until Monday.
Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baggett.
Invite to our staff holiday party tonight.
Mr. Bennett.
Till Monday. No more events till Monday.
Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins. I see you're going into alfalfa this year. Yeah, I am, Mark. Well, Mr. Coons.
And we're in another club. That'd be two of them. That'd be two clubs that have no purpose except to have lunch or dinner.
Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller,
Are you staying here this weekend?
I got a bunch of stuff.
Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin.
Right outside, please. And we're done for a while.
Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller,
Hey, Marco.
Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Donnelly, Feinstein, Franken, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Levin, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Grassley, Heller, Hoeven, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Scott, Sessions, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye.
To vote or change their votes? If not, the ayes are 54, the nays are 36. The motion is agreed to. Pursuant to the provisions of SREV 15 of the 113th Congress, there will now be up to 8 hours of post-cloture consideration of the nomination, equally divided in the usual form.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
It seems hard to believe, but tomorrow will be the anniversary of the deaths of 20 little boys and girls in Newtown, Connecticut. Not only those little boys and girls, but 6 educators whose lives were taken by an unspeakable tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School. The names: Allison, Aviel, Charlotte, Daniel, Olivia, Josephine, Anna, Dylan, Madeline, Catherine, James, Chase, Jesse, Grace, Noah, Jack, Emily, Carolyn, Jessica, and Benjamin. These little boys and girls were 6 and 7 years old. They were murdered. But although their years were few, their lives have touched and will continue to touch us all. As it did a year ago, my heart goes out to the families and those little angels, to all those affected by this tragedy. I honor the ultimate sacrifice of Victoria Soto, David Hochsprung, Mary Sherlock, Vaughn Rousseau, Rochelle Davino, Anna Marie Murphy. They're teachers and educators who died trying to safeguard the children in their care. These 6 educators devoted their lives to teaching children, Newtown's children, how to read and write, how to add and subtract, how to be good boys and girls, and how to grow into good men and women. And they gave their lives to keep those children safe. They're a source of hope in a world that sometimes seems hopeless. It's hard to comprehend the type of tragedy that occurred at Sandy Hook, let alone to recover from it. But I'm inspired by the families of this community who have found purpose in the face of despair. There's a Tibetan saying that says, quote, tragedy should be utilized as a source of strength, close quote. The Dalai Lama says that whatever trouble you have experienced and however deep your heartbreak, if we lose our hope, that's our real disaster. That's what the Dalai Lama said. These families have channeled their pain into activism, raising awareness about gun violence and mental health issues in the country. I met with them on a number of occasions, and their bravery in the face of such pain is truly an inspiration, not only to me, but to all of us. I'm proud of how hard my caucus fought this year to pass safeguards that would keep guns out of the hands of felons and people with severe mental illness. Mr. President, that's why 85% of the American people agree with this. Why should someone that has severe mental illness and someone who is a criminal be able to purchase a gun? They shouldn't. Those that are trying to stop that legislation going forward should be embarrassed, ashamed of themselves. I personally am happy with my vote to keep military-style weapons and large ammunition clips off the streets and to improve our mental health safety net. But at a time when more than 30,000 Americans are killed by guns each year, it's shameful that the United States Senate can't pass gun safety legislation that would protect our most vulnerable citizens, our kids, our children, our babies. So, Mr. President, I told the families of the 26 innocents killed a year ago and the 173 children killed by guns since December 14th, 2012, that Senate Democrats will not give up on them. And that's still the fact. Will not give up on the victims of 26 school shootings that have occurred since the Newtown massacre, one in Sparks, where a young man came with a gun who stepped forward to save the children, a teacher. He was killed. 2 others were injured in that assault. Will not give up on the families and friends of those gunned down at a movie theater in Colorado, a Sikh temple in Wisconsin, a shopping mall in Oregon, and every day on the streets of America, our cities. Last December, I promised the families a meaningful conversation about how to change America's culture of violence. I want everyone within the sound of my voice to know that the conversation is not over. The American people will prevail on this issue. When 85% of the American people believe in an issue, when 85% of the American people believe in not only an issue, a quest, in fairness, it's going to happen. It's only a question of when it happens. I urge the families and friends of those killed in Newton to never lose hope. Never lose hope.
The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of State, Ann W. Patterson of Virginia, career member of the Senior Foreign Service, class of career ambassador, to be an Assistant Secretary of State.
Mr. President.
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, I have to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, John Adams, America's first Vice President and second President, and whose bust sits right above us looking over the Senate every day, once said, and I quote him, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." Mr. President, it's been more than 3 years since President Obama signed the Affordable Care Act into law. At that time, its opponents have made every effort to misinform the American public about this law and the vital benefits it provides the American people. But as Adam said, facts are stubborn things. And I want to make sure facts about the Affordable Care Act do not get lost amongst the criticism and false claims. So here are the facts. Thanks to the Affordable Care Act, 100 million people have received free preventive care. More than 7 million seniors have saved nearly $9 billion on prescription drugs. And 25 million people who lacked health insurance will finally be able to get the coverage they need. The Affordable Care Act also helped slow the growth in health care costs. National health care spending grew by 3.9% each year from 2009 to 2011, the slowest rate on record. Mr. President, I can remember not too many years earlier, the annual rate of increase in health care costs in the neighborhood is 6, 7, 8, 9% a year. Dramatic reduction. That means we'll save huge sums of money down the line. For example, the CMS projection of national health care expenditures in 2019 has dropped by $574 billion in 3 years. That is $507 billion reduced projection of national health care costs in the year 2019. And while there is more than just the Affordable Care Act at work in those savings, it certainly has played a part. The health insurance marketplaces are open for business, and every day we hear how the website healthcare.gov is working better. It's picking up steam. It's handling more and more consumers. The New York Times reported on Tuesday that, and I'm quoting, the number of applicants who dropped a plan into their virtual grocery carts was climbing at a rapid clip, end quote. Those are the facts. The Affordable Care Act is helping millions of people. It is improving millions of lives. But frankly, I think the American people are a bit tired of hearing politicians argue over the law. I'm sure every one of my colleagues has spoken at length about it here on the Senate floor or back home, and I know I have. I think it's time to change the conversation. I think it's time to hear from the American people, hear from them, how they think the law is helping them. I think it's time to hear what the New York Times called, quote, the voices of quiet optimism and relief amid the uproar over the health law. Take these two stories. Claire He is a college student whose parents have never been able to afford insurance. She and her brother lived most of their lives without coverage. And she told the New York Times if they got the flu, quote, we just stayed home and waited it out. When Claire and her family sat down to look at their options under the Affordable Care Act, here's what they found. They found a high-quality plan that will cost them only $30 a month. Claire said of the ACA's critics, quote, I see so much negativity behind this, but in reality, there's a lot of families who are like mine, end quote. And then there's the story of Bruce Kleinschmidt, a lawyer who lives in Louisville, Kentucky. Bruce had insurance through his employer until he stopped working full-time. Bruce is 61, not yet eligible for Medicare. In another era, his health problems would have made it impossible for him to find insurance. But using Kentucky's new law marketplace, Bruce found a generous plan that saves him $300 a month in premiums. Bruce calls it, quote, a godsend. There are hundreds of similar stories in newspapers all across the nation. The San Jose Mercury News, Las Vegas Sun, Hartford Courier, Palm Beach Post, LA Times, many more. Not only do we read these kinds of personal stories in newspapers, we receive letters from them every day. Here are a few examples I've heard, letters I've received from Montanans. John wrote into my office with his family stories. What did he say? John's daughter recently beat cancer. She's under 26, so thanks to the Affordable Care Act, she is still covered under her parents' insurance. There's more. When she does turn 26, she will have guaranteed right to coverage. No insurance company can turn her away because she had cancer. John said they're counting on the Affordable Care Act to help them find an affordable plan. Marge wrote in to say that the act has been an enormous relief for her. She has battled emphysema for years, despite the fact she's not a smoker. A doctor told her she could never leave her job because no one else would ever insure her. So for Marge, the Affordable Care Act means she can breathe again. that she doesn't have to live in fear of losing her insurance or falling into bankruptcy because of her medical costs. And we all know, Mr. President, that many, many have told us before the act how many people went into bankruptcy because of health care costs, and one of the leading causes of bankruptcy is health care costs. And Jillian wrote in to say how excited she was to be able to shop for coverage in the marketplace. Jillian's married. She and her husband are expecting a child, but her husband's employer-sponsored plan does not pay for her coverage. So here's what she wrote, quote, "I'm looking to make a more affordable choice for me and my baby-to-be." Letters like these come in every day. They tell us stories of how the Affordable Care Act is working for them, it's helping them, and in the end, that's what matters. Not the punditry, not the polls, not the political points. What matters is that the law is improving the lives of millions of Americans. I yield the floor. And suggest the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.